Tonight, we're going back to a small farm in Bavaria in 1922. It sat at the edge of a forest, about a mile from the nearest hamlet. Isolated in a way that's difficult to imagine now. No close neighbors, no passing traffic, just fields, trees, and silence. 6 people lived there: a grandfather, a grandmother, their widowed daughter, her 2 young children, and a maid who had only arrived that afternoon. Sometime on the evening of the 31st of March, someone lured them into the barn one by one and killed them with a mattock. Then he went inside and killed the 2 who remained, a maid in her bed and an infant in his crib, and then he didn't leave. For days afterward, someone stayed at that farm. They fed the animals, they ate the food in the kitchen. Smoke was seen rising from the chimney. The bodies lay where they had fallen, and whoever had put them there went on living among them as if nothing had happened. When the victims were finally discovered, over 100 suspects would eventually be questioned. Arrests were made, theories multiplied. The case file grew for decades. No one was ever convicted. In the first half of this video, we'll go through what happened at that farm, the family, the secrets they kept, the days of strange warnings before the murders, and the investigation that followed. In the second half, we'll look at the psychology, what the killer's behavior reveals about his mind, what it means that he stayed, and why this case still holds people more than a century later. This is the story of the Hinterkaifeck murders. Hinterkaifeck was not a village, it was not even a hamlet. It was a single farmstead, alone at the edge of a forest, approximately 70 kilometers north of Munich in the German province of Bavaria. The name itself told you where it was, Hinter meaning behind in German. Kaifeck being the small nearby settlement. The farm was behind Kaifeck, about 1 mile north of it, bordered on one side by dense woods and on all others by open farmland. It had been built around 1863. By 1922, it was old, weathered, and deeply isolated in a way that few places in Central Europe still were. No other houses within easy sight. No road that anyone would travel unless they had specific business there. The farm belonged to Gruber, who had received ownership in 1877 as part of a divorce settlement with her first husband, Joseph Assam. That earlier marriage had produced 3 children. In 1886, Kazilia married Andreas Gruber, a man from the Bavarian locality of Grainstetten, and he moved to Hinterkaifeck to live with her. Together they had 2 daughters, Victoria, born in 1887, and Sophie, born in 1889. By 1922, Andreas was 63 years old. Kazilia was 72. They had lived on that farm together for over 35 years. Their daughter Victoria had married a man named Karl Gabriel, a native of the nearby town of Weidhofen, on the 11th of March, 1914. Ownership of Hinterkaifeck was transferred to the couple on that same date, but only months later, the First World War began, and Karl was called into the military. He was reported killed at the Battle of Arras on the 12th of December, 1914. His body was never recovered. Victoria was left a widow at 27. She had 1 daughter from the marriage, Kazilia Gabriel, born on the 9th of January, 1915, just weeks after her father's reported death. Victoria never remarried. She stayed at the farm with her parents. And what happened inside that household, behind the isolation and the silence, was something the community around them had known about for years. In 1915, Andreas Gruber and his daughter Victoria were convicted in Neighbour District Court of incest. The court established that the sexual relationship between father and daughter had lasted from 1907 to 1910. Andreas was sentenced to 1 year in prison. Victoria received 1 month. After serving their sentences, they returned to the farm, and the relationship did not end. In 1919, Victoria admitted to a man named Lawrence Schlittenbauer, a neighbor with whom she had been having an affair, that her newborn son, Joseph, had not been fathered by Schlittenbauer as he believed. The child had been conceived through her father's continuing sexual abuse. Schlittenbauer reported Andreas to the authorities. Andreas was arrested, but then Schlittenbauer withdrew his complaint, only to reassert his claims while giving sworn testimony at trial. The court found his contradictory behavior undermined his credibility and did not consider his testimony sufficient for conviction. Andreas was released. However, Andreas had made several incriminating statements during his own testimony. The court noted this and denied him compensation for his time in pretrial detention. Schlittenbauer, despite everything, agreed to formally adopt Joseph as his own son. So by the spring of 1922, this was the household at Hinterkaifeck. Andreas Gruber, 63, a man convicted of incest, widely known in the community as an abuser of his own daughter, living on a remote farm with no oversight and no consequences. His wife Kazilia, 72, who had lived alongside all of this for years. Their daughter Victoria, 35, a widow, a victim, and in the eyes of the law, a convicted participant in her own abuse, trapped on a farm she technically owned but could not escape. Victoria's daughter, Kazilia Gabriel, 7 years old, a child growing up in that house, surrounded by those dynamics. And Victoria's son Joseph, 2 years old, a child whose biological origins were a matter of public record, whose very existence was a monument to what had happened in that family. These 5 people lived together in a farmstead at the edge of a forest, a mile from anyone else, sealed inside a history that everyone knew about and no one could change. On the afternoon of the 31st of March, 1922, a 6th person arrived. Maria Baumgartner, 44 years old, the new maid. Her sister escorted her to the farm and left after a short stay. Maria's sister was most likely the last person to see any of them alive. In the months before the murders, something was wrong at Hinterkaifeck. The people who lived there knew it, and they told others, but no one did anything about it. The first sign came approximately 6 months before the killings, when the family's maid, Crescence Rieger, quit her position at the farm. Rieger had worked at Hinterkaifeck since November of 1920. By the late summer or early autumn of 1921, she could no longer tolerate it. She told people that she had heard strange noises coming from the attic, footsteps, movement, sounds that had no explanation. She believed the house was haunted, and she left. No one investigated, no one searched the attic. Rieger was gone, and the family carried on without her. Then, in March of 1922, Andreas Gruber found something on the property that unsettled him. It was a newspaper from Munich. He had not purchased it, no one in the household had purchased it. He initially assumed the postman had lost it, and it had ended up on the farm by mistake. But when he checked, no one in the vicinity subscribed to it either. The newspaper had no explanation. Someone had brought it there, or someone had left it behind. Days before the murders, things escalated. Andreas discovered tracks in the fresh snow. They led from the edge of the forest directly to a door on the farm's machine room, a door with a broken lock. The tracks led to the farm, they did not lead away from it. Someone had come out of the woods and walked to the building, and either they had left by a different route or they had not left at all. That same night, the Gruber family heard footsteps coming from the attic, the same sounds that had driven Crescence Rieger away months earlier. Andreas went up to search. He found no one. He told his neighbors about the footprints and the sounds. Several of them offered to help, to come and search the property, to look into what was happening. Andreas refused every offer. He did not report any of it to the police. Why he refused is something no one has ever been able to fully explain. Perhaps it was pride. Perhaps it was the stubbornness of a man who had lived on that farm for 35 years and could not accept that something was beyond his control. Perhaps it was the instinct of a man with secrets who did not want authorities or neighbors looking too closely at his household. Whatever the reason, Andreas said no, and the warnings went unheeded. There was also the matter of the missing keys. A set of house keys had disappeared from the Gruber household in the days before the murders. They were never found. And there was one more detail, reported later by a school friend of 7-year-old Kazilia Gabriel. According to this friend, young Kazilia had told her that on the night before the murders, her mother Victoria had fled the farmstead after a violent argument with Andreas. Victoria ran into the forest. She was found there hours later and brought back. The night before her death, Victoria Gabriel tried to leave, and she was returned to the place where she would be killed. On the afternoon of the 31st of March, 1922, a Friday, the new maid arrived to replace the one who had fled months earlier. Maria Baumgartner was 44 years old. She came to Hinterkaifeck to begin work that day. Her sister walked her to the farm, stayed briefly, and then left. Maria Baumgartner had worked at Hinterkaifeck for one day before she was murdered. She walked into a house where footsteps had been heard in the attic for months, where tracks appeared from the forest and did not return, where keys had gone missing, where a newspaper no one had bought appeared on the property, where the previous maid had quit because she believed the place was haunted. Every warning was there, every sign pointed toward something coming, and no one stopped it. Late on the evening of Friday, the 31st of March, 1922, the killing began. The exact sequence has been reconstructed by investigators based on where the bodies were found, the nature of their injuries, and the layout of the farm. What follows is what they believe happened. The first to die were not killed inside the house. They were lured to the barn. Victoria, her 7-year-old daughter Kazilia, and the elder Grubers, Andreas and his wife Kazilia, were drawn out of the living quarters and into the barn through the stable that connected the two buildings. Investigators initially theorized that restless animals may have made noises that prompted the family to check on them, but later examination cast doubt on this. Tests established that noise from the barn could not be heard from inside the house. How the killer got 4 people to walk into the barn, one after the other, remains one of the unanswered questions of the case. But he did, and he was waiting for them. They were killed one by one, not simultaneously, not in a frenzy, one at a time as each entered the barn. The weapon was a mattock, a heavy agricultural tool, similar to a pickaxe that belonged to the farm. The killer used it to deliver blows to the head. Each victim was struck and fell, and then the next was lured in. Andreas Gruber, his wife Kazilia, their daughter Victoria, and then 7-year-old Kazilia Gabriel, who walked into the barn and found what was waiting for her there. The bodies of all 4 were found stacked together in the barn, placed deliberately, not left where they fell, but gathered and arranged. The youngest victim in the barn was not killed instantly. When the autopsies were performed the following week, the court physician, Johann Baptist Ommler, determined that 7-year-old Kazilia Gabriel had survived the initial assault. Whether the killer knew she was still alive and left her there, or whether he believed she was dead and moved on, is unknown. But that child lay in the dark of that barn for hours, dying slowly among the bodies of her mother and grandparents. After the 4 in the barn were dead or dying, the killer moved into the house. Inside, 2 people remained. Maria Baumgartner, the maid who had arrived only that afternoon, was in her bedchamber, and 2-year-old Joseph lay in his bassinet. The killer entered the living quarters and killed them both with the same mattock, Maria in her bed, Joseph in his crib. 6 people, all dead by the same weapon, all killed within what was likely a short span of time, except for the child who was left to die alone in the straw. When it was over, the killer placed the mattock in the loft of the barn. And then he did something that separates this case from almost every other murder in recorded history. He stayed in the house where he had murdered people. For days after the murders, Hinterkaifeck sat in silence. No one came to check, no one raised an alarm. The farm was so isolated, and the family so accustomed to keeping to themselves, that their absence from the world went unnoticed for nearly a week. But during those days, someone was still at the farm, living there, moving through the rooms, existing among the dead. The first person to approach Hinterkaifeck after the murders was not an investigator or a concerned neighbor. It was a salesman. On the 1st of April, the day after the killings, coffee sellers Hans and Eduard Skirovsky arrived at the farm to take an order. They knocked on the door, they knocked on the window. No one answered. They walked around the yard and found no one present. They noticed that the gate to the machine room was open, but they decided to leave. It was not their concern. That same night, at approximately 3 in the morning, a farmer named Simon Rieslander was traveling to his home near Brunnen. As he passed near Hinterkaifeck, he saw 2 figures standing at the edge of the forest. When the strangers noticed him, they turned around so that their faces could not be seen. Rieslander kept walking. He did not investigate. He did not report what he saw. The following night, the 2nd of April, an artisan named Michael Plurkel happened to pass by the farm. He observed smoke coming from the chimney, indicating that the oven was being heated. As he approached, an unidentified person came out of the house and shone a lantern directly into his eyes, blinding his vision. Plurkle did not stay to ask questions. He continued on his way as quickly as he could. He noticed one other thing as he left. The smoke coming from the chimney had a revolting smell. Something was being burned inside that oven that was not wood. Plurkle's account was never properly investigated. No examination of the oven was ever conducted to determine what had been burned inside it. So in the first 2 days after the murders, at least 3 people came close to the farm. A pair of salesmen who knocked and left. A farmer who saw 2 figures in the dark. An artisan who was blinded by a lantern and smelled something foul burning. None of them knew what had happened inside. None of them reported anything to the authorities. Meanwhile, the evidence of continued habitation was accumulating inside the farmstead. Someone had fed the cattle. The entire supply of bread had been consumed from the kitchen. Meat had been recently cut from the pantry. The oven had been used. Someone was eating, sleeping, and tending to the animals, while 6 bodies lay in the barn and in the house. On the 4th of April, a Tuesday, 4 days after the murders, 7-year-old Cecilia Gabriel's absence from school was finally noted. She had not appeared for several days without any excuse being sent. The Gruber family had also failed to appear for Sunday worship. That same morning, a local mechanic named Albert Hoffner arrived at the farm. He had been scheduled to repair an engine. He waited for an hour. No one came to meet him. He saw no sign of anyone on the property. Hoffner did something remarkable. Rather than leaving, he simply went ahead and completed the repair by himself. He worked alone at the farm for approximately 4.5 hours. Then he left. 4.5 hours alone on a property where 6 people lay dead, and he noticed nothing. Or perhaps more accurately, there was nothing left to notice. Whoever had stayed at the farm in the days after the murders had, by then, already gone. Later that same day, the 4th of April, at around 3:30 in the afternoon, Lawrence Schlittenbauer decided to send someone to check on the family. Schlittenbauer was the neighbor who had been Victoria's lover, the man who had adopted 2-year-old Joseph as his own son, the man who had reported Andreas Gruber for incest and then withdrawn the complaint. He lived nearby and had reason to be concerned about the child he considered his. He sent his 16-year-old son Johann and his 9-year-old stepson Joseph Dick to walk to Hinterkaifeck and see whether they could make contact with anyone. The boys went to the farm, looked around, and came back reporting that they had not seen a single person. Schlittenbauer decided to go himself. He gathered 2 neighbors, Michael Pearl and Jakob Sigel, and the 3 men walked to Hinterkaifeck together later that evening. When they arrived, every door was locked. They could not get in through any of the normal entrances. They broke through a gate to enter the barn. Inside, they found 4 bodies: Andreas Gruber, his wife Cecilia, their daughter Victoria, and 7-year-old Cecilia Gabriel, stacked together in the straw. What happened next raised questions that would follow Schlittenbauer for the rest of his life. Immediately after finding the bodies in the barn, Schlittenbauer apparently unlocked the front door of the house without difficulty and entered the living quarters alone. Pearl and Sigel remained outside. Schlittenbauer went in by himself into a house where, for all anyone knew, the murderer could still be present. Inside, he found the bodies of Maria Baumgartner in her bedchamber and Joseph in his bassinet. When asked later why he had entered the house alone when the killer's whereabouts were unknown, Schlittenbauer said he went to look for Joseph. He also disturbed the bodies at the scene. He moved things, he touched things. By the time anyone else entered, the positions of the dead had already been altered. A set of house keys had gone missing from the Gruber household in the days before the murders. Schlittenbauer had unlocked the front door without apparent difficulty. No one could adequately explain how he had done this if the house was truly locked and the keys were gone. The authorities were notified. An investigative team from Munich, led by Inspector Jorgreen Gruber, was assigned to the case. But the damage to the crime scene had only just begun. In the hours and days that followed, the farm was overrun. Onlookers arrived from the surrounding area. They moved through the rooms, they moved around the bodies, they handled objects. They shifted potential evidence from where it lay. Some of them cooked meals in the kitchen, the same kitchen where the killer had eaten bread and cut meat from the pantry while the family lay dead around him. By the time the investigators had full control of the scene, it had been irreparably contaminated. On the 5th of April, the day after the discovery, court physician Johann Baptist Ommler performed autopsies inside the barn. He confirmed that all 6 victims had been killed by blows to the head with a heavy implement, consistent with a mattock. He determined that young Casilia Gabriel had survived for several hours after the initial attack, and he noted the condition of each body. The skulls of all 6 victims were removed and sent to Munich for further examination. The murder weapon, the mattock, was not found during the initial search of the scene. It was located later, hidden in the loft of the barn. Investigators initially suspected robbery as the motive. Traveling craftsmen and vagrants from the surrounding area were questioned. But this theory collapsed when a large sum of money was discovered inside the house, untouched. Whoever had done this had not come for money, or if he had not taken it. What the investigators could confirm was this. After killing 6 people on the night of the 31st of March, someone had remained at the farm for days. The cattle had been recently fed, the bread was gone, the meat had been cut, the oven had been used. The killer had not fled into the night. He had stayed and lived and tended to the animals as though the farm were his. And then, at some point before Albert Hofner arrived on the morning of the 4th of April, he had gone. The investigation into the Hinterkaifeck murders would eventually span decades. Over 100 suspects were questioned, arrests were made. Theories multiplied and contradicted one another, and in the end, no one was ever convicted. The case was officially closed in 1955. The last interrogations took place in 1986, when Detective Chief Superintendent Konrad Müller-Thumann conducted final interviews before his retirement. But in the weeks, months, and years after the discovery, suspicion circled back again and again to the same small group of people. The first and most persistent suspect was Lawrence Schlittenbauer. His behavior on the day of the discovery had raised immediate questions. How had he unlocked the front door so easily when all doors were locked and the house keys had been missing for days? Why had he entered the house alone without waiting for the other men when the killer's presence could not be ruled out? Why had he disturbed the bodies before anyone else could see them? Schlittenbauer had motive. He had been Victoria's lover. He had adopted Joseph as his son. He had reported Andreas for incest and then entangled himself in contradictory testimony at trial. His relationship with the family was one of intimacy, resentment, and unresolved grievance. In the years that followed, comments attributed to Schlittenbauer deepened the suspicion. In 1925, 3 years after the murders, Schlittenbauer was discovered visiting the demolished remains of Hinterkaifeck. When asked why he was there, he made a remark that startled those who heard it. He said that the killer's attempt to bury the family's remains in the barn had been hindered by frozen ground. This suggested knowledge of conditions at the farmstead on the night of the murders, knowledge that only someone who had been there would possess. Though as a neighboring farmer familiar with the local land, he could conceivably have been making an educated guess about the state of the ground in late March. Schlittenbauer was never charged. Before his death in 1941, he conducted and won several civil lawsuits for slander against people who publicly called him the murderer of Hinterkaifeck. He denied it until the day he died, and no one could prove otherwise. The second suspect was Karl Gabriel, Victoria's husband. Gabriel had been reported killed at the Battle of Arras in December of 1914, but his body was never recovered from the battlefield. After the murders, speculation arose that Gabriel had not died in the war at all, that he had somehow survived, learned of the incest and the children born from it, and returned to take his revenge. This theory gained a strange second life after the Second World War. German prisoners of war returning from Soviet captivity in the Schrobenhausen region reported that they had been released early by a German-speaking Soviet officer who claimed to be the Hinterkaifeck murderer. Some theorized that this officer was Gabriel, that he had deserted during the First World War, made his way to Russia, and lived there for decades. But some of the returning prisoners later revised their statements, and 2 soldiers who had served with Gabriel during the war, Joseph Bichler and Nikolaus Haas, both stated that they had positively identified his body in the field after the battle. The Gabriel theory could never be confirmed or eliminated. It existed in the space between possibility and rumor. The third suspects were the Gump brothers, Adolf and Anton. Adolf Gump was identified as a suspect within the first week after the murders, on the 9th of April, 1922. His connection to the far-right paramilitary organization Freikorps Oberland raised alarms. As a Freikorps member, Gump was said to have participated in the killing of 9 farmers in Upper Silesia during the Polish uprising of 1921. A warrant had been issued for his arrest by the District Court of Oppel in connection with those murders. The case against the Gump brothers resurfaced decades later. In 1951, their sister Crescentia Mayer made a deathbed claim that Adolf and Anton had committed the Hinterkaifeck murders. Anton was taken into custody. Adolf had already died in 1944. After a short period, Anton was released. In 1954, the case against him was officially discontinued because his participation could not be proven. A deathbed accusation from a sister, no evidence to support it, another dead end. Then there were Karl S. and Andreas S., 2 brothers from the nearby village of Saddleburg. In 1971, nearly 50 years after the murders, a woman identified only as Therese T. wrote a letter to investigators. She described something she had witnessed as a 12-year-old child. The mother of the 2 brothers had visited Therese's mother, and during the conversation had said that her sons had committed the murders at Hinterkaifeck. The mother reportedly added that Andreas regretted losing his penknife during the crime. When the farmstead had been demolished in 1923, a penknife had indeed been discovered in the hay in the barn. It could not be clearly assigned to anyone. But the former maid, Crescence Rieger, was certain she had already seen the knife in the yard during her time working at the farm. It may have belonged to the victims all along. The lathe was followed, it produced nothing. Peter Weber was named as a suspect by a man named Joseph Betts. The 2 had worked together as laborers in the winter of 1919 to 1920, sharing a room. According to Betts, Weber had spoken of a remote farm called Hinterkaifeck and demonstrated knowledge of the Gruber family, including the incest between Andreas and Victoria. However, the incest had been public knowledge since the 1915 trial. Weber had also suggested killing Andreas to steal the family's money. When Betts did not respond to the offer, Weber dropped the subject. Weber was questioned, nothing came of it. The former maid Crescence Rieger, the woman who had quit because she believed the farm was haunted, offered her own suspicions. She pointed to the brothers Anton and Karl Bichler, along with a former Hinterkaifeck farmhand named Georg Siegel. Anton Bichler had helped with the potato harvest at the farm and was therefore familiar with the layout of the property. Rieger reported that Bichler had often spoken of the Gruber family and suggested they ought to be dead. She also emphasized that the family dog, which barked at nearly every visitor, never barked at Anton. Rieger reported one more detail. On the night of the murders, she said, a stranger had spoken to her through her window. She believed it was Karl Bichler, Anton's brother. Georg Siegel had worked at Hinterkaifeck and knew of the family's fortune. He was alleged to have broken into the house in November of 1920 and stolen a number of items, a claim he denied. But he did admit to one thing. He had carved the handle of the mattock when he worked at the farm, and he knew exactly where the tool was kept inside the barn. The Bichler brothers and Siegel were investigated. None were ever charged. Rieger also pointed to the Thaler brothers, Joseph and Andreas, who had committed several burglaries in the area before the murders. She said that Joseph, accompanied by an unidentified stranger, had appeared at her window one night and asked her questions about the family. Joseph reportedly claimed to know which family member slept in which room and stated that they had a lot of money. According to Rieger, Joseph and the stranger looked toward the machine room and turned their eyes upward. Another set of suspects who knew the farm, knew the family, and knew where the money was. Another lead that went nowhere. The final suspect came nearly a century later. In 2017, author Bill James published a book called The Man from the Train, in which he connected dozens of family murders across the United States to a single killer, a German-speaking immigrant named Paul Mueller. Mueller had been the sole suspect in the 1898 murder of a family in Massachusetts. A year-long manhunt followed his identification. He was never found. James's theory was that Mueller had returned to Germany by approximately 1912, after private investigators and journalists in America began to notice and publicize patterns in family murders across state lines. The Hinterkaifeck murders bore similarities to Mueller's suspected crimes, an entire family killed in an isolated home. The blunt edge of a farm tool used as a weapon, bodies moved and stacked after death, no robbery despite available money. James rated the chances of Mueller being the Hinterkaifeck killer as, in his own words, more or less a toss-up. He concluded that there was no real reason to believe it was not him, but equally no proof that it was. And there was one final moment that belonged to no suspect and no theory. In May of 1927, 5 years after the murders, a stranger stopped a resident of Waidhofen at midnight. He asked the man questions about the Hinterkaifeck case. And then loudly he identified himself as the murderer. Before the resident could react, the stranger turned and ran into the forest. He was never identified, he was never seen again. Less than a year after the murders, the farm itself was demolished. The intent was to remove any reminder of the violence that had taken place there. But during the demolition, additional evidence was uncovered, a mattock covered in dried blood hidden in the attic, and the penknife in the hay in the barn. A small concrete memorial was erected close to where the farm once stood. It is still there today. The Hinterkaifeck murders were never solved, not by the Munich investigators who arrived in April of 1922, not by the prosecutors who questioned suspects for decades, not by the detective who conducted his final interviews in 1986 before closing the file. Everyone was suspected, no one was proven. That's the story of what happened at Hinterkaifeck. The family, the secrets, the warnings no one heeded, and the investigation that produced over 100 suspects and 0 convictions. But the facts alone don't answer the questions that make this case impossible to forget. Why did the killer stay at the farm for days afterward? What does it mean that he lured his victims one by one rather than attacking them together? What kind of mind can feed animals and eat bread while surrounded by the people he has just killed? In part 2, we're going to go through the psychology behind this case, what the killer's behavior reveals about who he was, what drove him, and why this farm at the edge of a forest still refuses to release its grip on people more than a century later. After the last body fell, after Maria Baumgartner was struck in her bed and 2-year-old Joseph was killed in his crib, the killer did not leave. He stayed at the farm for days. He fed the cattle, he ate the bread in the kitchen, he cut meat from the pantry, he used the oven. Smoke was seen rising from the chimney by a man who passed by the following night. When that man approached, someone inside the house came to the door and shone a lantern into his eyes to blind him, then retreated back inside. The killer was not hiding, he was inhabiting. This single detail, the decision to remain, is what elevates the Hinterkaifeck case from a terrible crime into something that has haunted investigators and psychologists for over a century. Because staying changes everything about how we understand the person who did this. In forensic behavioral analysis, there is an important distinction between what a killer does because he needs to and what he does because something inside him compels it. The first category is called modus operandi. It includes every action that serves the practical goal of committing the crime and avoiding detection. Choosing an isolated target is modus operandi. Killing at night is modus operandi. Using a weapon that is already present at the scene rather than bringing one is modus operandi. The second category is called signature behavior. These are actions that serve no practical purpose, that don't help the killer commit the crime or escape afterward, but that he performs anyway because they fulfill some internal psychological need. Staying at the farm for 3 days was not modus operandi. It did not help the killer avoid detection. If anything, it dramatically increased his risk. Every hour he remained was another hour in which someone could have arrived, found the bodies, and trapped him there. The coffee sellers came on the 1st of April. The farmer saw figures at the forest edge that same night. The artisan was blinded by the lantern on the second night. The mechanic spent 4.5 hours on the property on the 4th of April. Any one of these encounters could have ended differently. Any one of them could have led to the killer's capture, but he stayed anyway. This tells us something fundamental about the person who did this. The farm after the murders was not simply a crime scene to him. It was something else. A place he felt entitled to be, a place he was not finished with, a place that in some psychological sense he experienced as his own. There are a limited number of explanations for why a killer remains at the scene of a mass murder for an extended period. One possibility is that the killer had a prior relationship with the farm itself. That Hinterkaifeck was not a random target but a specific one, chosen because of what it represented to him. If the killer believed, consciously or unconsciously, that the farm belonged to him, or that the people inside it had taken something from him, then staying afterward could represent a kind of reclamation. He was not lingering at a crime scene. He was returning to a place he felt had been denied to him. This interpretation aligns with several of the suspects who had personal connections to the family. Schlittenbauer, who had a child he believed was being kept from him. Karl Gabriel, whose wife and property had been consumed by the household he left behind. Even Georg Siegel, who knew the farm intimately and may have felt wronged by the family. A second possibility is that staying was part of the killer's psychological process. Some offenders experience a period after extreme violence in which they are not yet ready to return to the ordinary world. The act has put them into an altered state, a dissociative calm, a sense of unreality, a feeling of having stepped outside of normal time, and they remain at the scene because they have not yet found their way back to the person they were before. In this reading, the killer's actions at the farm, feeding the animals, eating, heating the oven, were not calculated decisions but automatic behaviors. The body continuing to function while the mind processed what had happened. He moved through the domestic routines of the farm because those routines were simpler than confronting what he had done. A third possibility is the most disturbing. That staying was the point, that the murders were not the end goal but the means to something else, the experience of existing alone in a space that he had emptied of everyone who had previously occupied it. That what the killer wanted was not simply for these people to be dead, but to be in their place. To sit where they sat, to eat their food, to tend their animals, to live, however briefly, inside the life he had taken from them. This interpretation frames the days after the murders not as an afterthought, but as the culmination. The killing was what made the staying possible, and the staying was what he had actually come for. We cannot know with certainty which of these explanations is correct, but what we can say is that all of them point to the same underlying conclusion. This was not a crime of impulse. It was not a robbery interrupted. It was not a sudden explosion of violence followed by panic and flight. This was someone who walked into a farm at the edge of a forest, killed everyone inside it, and then settled in as though he had come home. The killer did not attack 6 people at once. He did not burst into a room and overwhelm them with sudden, chaotic violence. He lured them to the barn one at a time, and he killed them one at a time. This is not a minor detail. It is one of the most psychologically revealing aspects of the entire case. 4 people, Victoria, 7-year-old Kazilia, Andreas, and his wife Kazilia, were drawn from the living quarters through the stable and into the barn. One after the other, each one entering a space where the previous victim already lay dead or dying, each one walking into the dark without knowing what waited on the other side. The killer stood in that barn and waited. He killed the first person who entered, then he waited again and again and again. This requires something that most people, even most killers, do not possess. It requires the ability to hold yourself in a state of absolute controlled readiness while standing next to a body you have just created. To manage your breathing, your movement, your noise level, knowing that the next victim is approaching and that any sound, any misstep, any loss of composure will alert them and destroy the entire plan. 4 times he did this, 4 separate moments of waiting, controlling himself, and then striking. In criminal psychology, this kind of sequential, controlled killing is considered one of the strongest indicators of prior experience. A first-time killer is overwhelmed by what he has done. The first death produces a cascade of physiological responses: adrenaline, trembling, nausea, tunnel vision, auditory exclusion. The body reacts to killing as though it has been in a life-threatening encounter. because in evolutionary terms, extreme violence registers as danger regardless of which side you are on. A person experiencing these responses for the first time cannot calmly stand in the dark and wait for the next victim to walk in. His hands would be shaking. His heart would be hammering, his breath would be audible. The fine motor control required to remain silent and strike accurately with a heavy tool would be severely compromised. But the Hinterkaifeck killer managed it 4 times in succession. Each kill was clean enough and quiet enough that the next person still came. No one screamed loudly enough to alert the rest of the house. No one fled, no one locked a door. The sequence was never interrupted. This points to what behavioral analysts call a mature modus operandi, a pattern of criminal behavior that is too refined and too controlled to be someone's first offense. The concept is straightforward. Every killer learns. The first crime is messier, more impulsive, more emotionally chaotic than what comes after. With each subsequent offense, the process becomes tighter. The killer identifies what works and what doesn't. He eliminates unnecessary risks. He develops techniques for managing his own psychological state during and after the act. By the time a modus operandi appears mature, by the time it looks like the Hinterkaifeck crime scene, the person behind it has usually committed violence before. The learning has already happened somewhere else. There is another dimension to the one-by-one method that deserves attention, and it has to do with how the killer related to his victims in the moment of killing. When someone attacks a group simultaneously, bursting in with a weapon, striking wildly, the victims function as a collective threat. They are a room full of people who might fight back, who might overwhelm him with numbers. The violence in those cases tends to be frantic, poorly aimed, and driven by the need to neutralize everyone before anyone can respond. That is not what happened here. Each victim was isolated before being killed. They were alone with the killer at the moment of their death. They were not part of a group that needed to be overwhelmed. They were individuals, encountered one at a time in a confined space. This changes the psychological dynamic entirely. The killer was not managing a group. He was managing a series of individual encounters. Each one was, in a sense, its own event, its own moment of confrontation, its own act of killing that was complete in itself before the next began. This suggests a killer who could compartmentalize with extraordinary efficiency, who could treat each murder as a discrete task, complete it, reset himself psychologically, and then prepare for the next. It also suggests something about how he thought of the people he was killing. If you are luring individuals to their death one at a time, you are not thinking of them as a family. You are not thinking of them as a unit. You are thinking of them as a sequence, a list to be worked through, a series of problems, each to be solved in turn. This level of psychological detachment, the ability to reduce 6 human beings to a sequence of tasks, is not something that emerges spontaneously. It is built over time. Through prior violence, through rehearsal, through whatever internal process allows a person to stand in the dark next to a body and feel nothing urgent enough to make him leave. There is one final element of the sequential method that is worth considering. The killer chose to lure them rather than go to them. He positioned himself in the barn and drew them to him rather than moving through the house striking people in their beds. This is a meaningful choice. Going to the victims is more efficient. It eliminates the uncertainty of whether they will come. It removes the risk that someone will refuse to leave the house or will become suspicious. But it also means killing people where they feel safe, in their beds, in their rooms, surrounded by their belongings. The killer has to enter their space. Luring them to the barn reversed this dynamic. The victims left the safety of the house and entered his space. They came to him. They walked into the place he had prepared. Whether this was purely tactical, the barn offered more space, less noise transfer, fewer escape routes, or whether it carried some psychological significance for the killer, we cannot say with certainty. But the effect is the same. 6 people lived at Hinterkaifeck, and one by one they were drawn out of their home and into the dark, where someone was waiting for them with a mattock he already knew how to use. One of the most persistent questions in the Hinterkaifeck case is not who did it, but why. And the answer that most people reach for first, the answer that feels most obvious, is the incest. Andreas Gruber sexually abused his daughter Victoria for years. This was not rumor, it was not speculation. It was a matter of public record. He was convicted in 1915. He He was accused again in 1919. The second child, Joseph, was his. Everyone in the surrounding community knew this. The courts knew. The neighbors knew. Lawrence Schlittenbauer knew because Victoria told him directly. And the family continued to live together on that farm, isolated, unchanged, as though the convictions and the accusations had altered nothing. This creates a psychological environment in which violence becomes not just possible, but, in a sense, overdetermined. There were too many reasons for someone to want this family destroyed, too many people who had been drawn into the orbit of what was happening at Hinterkaifeck and had come away damaged by it. To understand why, it helps to consider what the incest actually meant for the people around the Gruber family, not just for the victims themselves. Schlittenbauer entered a relationship with Victoria, believing that her child was his. When he learned the truth that Joseph had been conceived through her father's abuse, he was not just betrayed, he was implicated. He had adopted a child born of incest. He had been intimate with a woman who was simultaneously being abused by her own father. His identity as a man, as a father, as a member of the community had been built on a foundation that turned out to be something grotesque. The psychological response to that kind of revelation is not simple anger. It is something closer to contamination. The feeling that you have been made part of something unspeakable without your knowledge or consent, that your own life has been used as a cover for something you find abhorrent. Whether Schlittenbauer killed the family or not, the emotional architecture was there, the sense of having been deceived at the deepest possible level. The humiliation of public knowledge. Everyone in the community knew what Andreas had done, which meant everyone in the community knew what Schlittenbauer's relationship with Victoria really meant. He was not her rescuer, he was another figure in the same sordid constellation. Karl Gabriel, if he survived the war, would have carried a different but equally corrosive form of this contamination. He married Victoria in 1914. The incest had been ongoing since 1907. Which means that during their entire courtship, during their marriage, during the transfer of property, Victoria was being abused by her father. Gabriel's marriage, his home, his ownership of the farm, all of it existed inside a reality he did not know about. If Gabriel learned the truth afterward, if he survived Eris, if he heard what had happened in the years since, the farm would not have been a home to return to. It would have been the site of his own deception. A place where everything he thought was real had been built on lies. And then there is Victoria herself. This is the dimension that is most often overlooked when people discuss the motive for Hinterkaifeck. Victoria was not simply a victim. She was also a mother living inside an abusive household with her 2 children. She had tried to leave. We know this because of the account from the night before the murders, when she fled into the forest after a violent argument with her father and was found and brought back. Victoria knew what was happening. She could not stop it. She could not leave. The one time she tried, she was retrieved. In the psychology of family violence, this kind of entrapment creates a specific and devastating dynamic. The abused person becomes, over time, both victim and unwilling participant in a system they cannot escape. They are forced into proximity with their abuser. They are forced to maintain a household, raise children, and present a functional exterior while living inside something that is destroying them. This does not make Victoria responsible for what happened to her, but it does illuminate why the Hinterkaifeck household was a place where violence had been accumulating for years, invisible, unacknowledged, building pressure with no outlet. When violence is present inside a family for a long time, when abuse is known and tolerated by the surrounding community, when courts convict and then release, when neighbors hear rumors and do nothing, the household becomes a kind of sealed container. Pressure builds, shame compounds, resentment deepens, and the people outside who have been drawn into the orbit of that family carry fragments of the contamination with them. Schlittenbauer carried it, Gabriel, if he lived, carried it, the neighbors carried it. Even the former maid Crescent's Reger carried it. She had lived in that house, heard the noises in the attic, and fled. And this is what makes the question of motive so impossible to resolve in this case. The incest did not create one motive for murder. It created many. It radiated outward from that farm and gave 6 different people a reason to want the Gruber household to cease to exist. Any one of them could have reached a breaking point. Any one of them could have walked into that barn with a mattock on the night of the 31st of March. The incest does not solve the case. It explains why the case has so many suspects. It explains why so many people had reason, means, and emotional justification to do what was done. And it explains something else, something more uncomfortable. It explains why no one came looking for 4 days. The Gruber family was not beloved. They were not the kind of household that people checked on out of affection or concern. They were a family that the community had tried to address through the courts and then given up on. A family that people kept their distance from. A family that, in the quiet moral calculus of a small Bavarian community in 1922, may not have been worth saving. This is not to say that anyone in the community condoned the murders, but the 4-day silence, the days in which no one came, no one checked, no one raised an alarm, is not entirely explained by the farm's isolation. It is also explained by the fact that the Gruber family existed in a space that the community around them had already decided to leave alone. The killer, whoever he was, may have known this. He may have understood that these were people whose disappearance would not be immediately noticed. That the same shame and revulsion that had isolated the family in life would protect him in the days after their death. The incest did not just provide the motive, it provided the cover. Lawrence Schlittenbauer is not the most likely suspect in the Hinterkaifeck case because of any single piece of evidence. He is the most likely suspect because of the accumulation of small things, behaviors, comments, moments of access that together form a pattern difficult to dismiss. But there is a danger in reading that pattern too simply, and understanding that danger requires understanding something about the psychology of suspicion itself. Schlittenbauer was the first person to enter the house after the bodies were found. He unlocked the front door without apparent difficulty when all doors were supposedly locked and the house keys had been missing for days. He entered alone, he disturbed the bodies. He offered an explanation that he was looking for Joseph that struck some as inadequate. In the years that followed, he made comments that seemed to reveal knowledge only the killer would possess. His remark in 1925 about frozen ground preventing the burial of remains, his visits to the demolished site, his apparent preoccupation with details of the crime that went beyond what a grieving neighbor or adoptive father might reasonably know. Taken together, these details create what feels like an obvious conclusion. Schlittenbauer did it. He had the key. He had the motive. He knew things he shouldn't have known. He behaved like a guilty man. But behavioral analysis requires more caution than that. In criminal psychology, there is a well-documented phenomenon in which individuals with close personal connections to a crime, particularly those who discover the bodies, exhibit behaviors that mimic guilt even when they are innocent. The reason is straightforward. A person who discovers a murder scene involving people they knew intimately does not react the way a stranger would. They do not stand back and wait for authorities. They do not treat the scene as evidence to be preserved. They react as people with shock, with urgency, with the desperate need to find the one person they came looking for. Schlittenbauer came to Hinterkaifeck that evening because his son, or the child he believed was his son, lived there. When he found 4 bodies in the barn, his first thought was not about evidence preservation. It was about Joseph. He went into the house because a 2-year-old child might still be alive inside. That he had a key is suspicious, but Victoria could have given him one at any point during their relationship. A man who had adopted her child and maintained a connection to the household having a key to the front door is not, by itself, evidence of murder. That he disturbed the bodies is suspicious, but a man in shock, confronting the deaths of people he knew, one of whom was the mother of the child he considered his, does not behave with forensic precision. He touches things, he moves things, he acts on impulse rather than protocol. This is where the psychology of suspicion becomes complicated. Because the very behaviors that make Schlittenbauer look guilty are also the behaviors that would be expected of an innocent man in his exact position, a man with a key, a personal connection, and a child he was desperate to find. The same ambiguity applies to his later comments. His remark about the frozen ground could indicate first-hand knowledge of conditions on the night of the murders. Or it could be the kind of speculation that a neighboring farmer, intimately familiar with the land and obsessed with an unsolved case, might naturally produce over the course of 3 years of turning the events over in his mind. People who are close to a crime that is never solved do not stop thinking about it. They reconstruct, they theorize. They develop detailed internal narratives about what must have happened, based on their knowledge of the setting, the people, and the circumstances. Over time, those narratives can become so detailed and so confident that they sound like memory. They sound like the words of someone who was there. This is the same psychological territory that made Reverend Kelly's confessions in the Villisca case so difficult to interpret. When a person is deeply enmeshed with a crime, emotionally, personally, geographically, their knowledge of it can grow to a point where it becomes indistinguishable from guilt, even when it isn't. Schlittenbauer lived next to that farm. He had a relationship with the victim. He had a child in the household. He had been publicly humiliated by the incest revelation. He was one of the first people on the scene, and then he lived in the shadow of the unsolved case for 19 years until his death in 1941. 19 years of suspicion, of neighbors whispering, of the knowledge that people thought he had done it. He sued multiple people for slander and won, but winning a lawsuit does not stop people from believing what they believe. Whether Schlittenbauer was guilty or innocent, he lived inside the case for the rest of his life. It consumed him either way, either as the man who committed the murders and spent 2 decades hiding it, or as the man who didn't and spent 2 decades being punished for proximity. There is one more psychological dimension worth considering. In cases where a suspect inserts himself into the discovery of a crime, where he is the one who finds the bodies, who enters the scene first, who takes charge of the initial response, investigators often consider the possibility that this behavior is an attempt to control the narrative. A guilty person who discovers the bodies himself gets to determine what the scene looks like when others arrive. He gets to touch things, move things, explain things before anyone else has a chance to observe the undisturbed scene. He frames the story from the very first moment. This is a recognized pattern in criminal behavior. It appears in cases of arson where the person who set the fire is also the one who calls it in. In cases of poisoning where the killer is the one who rushes the victim to hospital. In cases of domestic violence where the abuser is the first to call for help. If Schlittenbauer was guilty, his behavior on the 4th of April fits this pattern precisely. He sent his children first, a preliminary check that gave him plausible reason to arrive later. He brought witnesses so that his discovery would appear natural. He found the bodies in the barn and then immediately entered the house alone, giving himself time with the scene before Pearl and Sigel could follow. But if he was innocent, his behavior also makes sense. A worried father sends his children to check. When they report no contact, he goes himself with neighbors for safety. He finds horrors in the barn and rushes to the house to find his son. He is in shock. He does not think about evidence. Both readings are equally plausible, and this is the fundamental problem with Schlittenbauer as a suspect. Everything he did can be explained by guilt, and everything he did can be explained by grief, panic, and proximity. The two are perfectly overlapping in his case, and no piece of evidence has ever been found that separates them. He is the suspect who fits best, and he is the suspect who cannot be proven, and those two things may be true simultaneously forever without resolution. More than a century has passed since the night of the 31st of March, 1922. The farm is gone. It was demolished less than a year after the murders, torn down deliberately so that no physical trace of what happened there would remain. A small concrete memorial stands where the buildings once were, nothing else. The case was officially closed in 1955. The last interrogations were conducted in 1986. Every suspect is dead. Every witness is dead. Every investigator who worked the case is dead. And yet Hinterkaifeck persists. It circulates through books, documentaries, forums, and discussions with a tenacity that defies its age. People who have no connection to Bavaria, no connection to the Gruber family, no connection to the early 20th century, find themselves drawn into this case and unable to set it down. The question is why, and the answer has less to do with the facts of the case than with something fundamental about how the human mind processes unfinished stories. In psychology, there is a well-known principle called the Zeigarnik effect. It was first described in the 1920s, the same decade as the murders themselves, by psychologist Bluma Zeigarnik. She observed that people remember incomplete tasks far more vividly and persistently than completed ones. The explanation is that when something is resolved, when a story has an ending, when a question has an answer, when a task is finished, the brain files it away. The mental tension around it dissolves. It moves from active processing into long-term storage, where it fades. But when something remains unfinished, the brain cannot file it. It stays in an open loop. It occupies mental resources. It resurfaces at unexpected moments. It demands attention because the system that manages it cannot mark it as complete. The Hinterkaifeck murders are one of the largest open loops in the history of criminal investigation. 6 people were killed. The crime scene was described. The suspects were identified and discussed at extraordinary length across decades of investigation. Every detail was examined. Every theory was proposed. And then nothing, no conviction, no definitive answer, no ending. The brain cannot accept this. It returns to the case involuntarily, turning the same details over, trying different suspects, re-examining the same evidence from different angles. Not because new information has emerged, but because the loop was never closed and the mind keeps trying to close it. This is why you are still listening, not because the Hinterkaifeck case is uniquely complex. In many ways it is frustratingly simple, a murder in a remote location with a limited pool of suspects. But because the absence of a resolution creates a psychological tension that cannot be discharged. And there is a second layer that makes this case particularly resistant to release. When a crime is solved, the fear it generates becomes containable. The killer has a name, a face, a story. He becomes a specific person with specific reasons, and the brain can categorize him, understand him, and file him away. The threat becomes bounded. It exists within a defined set of circumstances that can be identified and, in theory, avoided. When a crime is unsolved, the fear remains diffuse. The killer is no one and therefore potentially anyone. He has no face, no name, no story that explains him. The brain cannot reduce him to something manageable because there is nothing specific to reduce. In the Hinterkaifeck case, this effect is magnified by the nature of what the killer did after the murders. Here he stayed. A killer who flees can be understood within a framework of self-preservation. He committed a terrible act and then ran from the consequences. This is comprehensible. It follows a logic the brain can process. But a killer who stays, who feeds the animals, eats the food, heats the oven, and lives among the dead for days, does not fit inside any framework the brain finds reassuring. He cannot be categorized as impulsive because he stayed. He cannot be categorized as calculating because staying dramatically increased his risk. He cannot be categorized as insane because he performed rational domestic tasks during his occupation of the farm. He exists in a space between categories, and it is in that space, in the gap between what we can explain and what we cannot, that the deepest psychological discomfort lies. The Hinterkaifeck killer is not just unidentified, he is uncategorizable. And that combination, the open loop of the unsolved case joined with the uncategorizable nature of the killer's behavior, creates a psychological object that the brain cannot process, cannot file, and cannot release. There is one final dimension to the persistence of this case, and it has to do with the setting itself. Hinterkaifeck was not a house on a busy street. It was not a building surrounded by neighbors who might have heard something. It was a single farm at the edge of a forest, a mile from anyone, sealed inside its own silence. That isolation functions as a psychological amplifier. It removes every reassurance that people normally rely on when processing violent crime. There were no neighbors to hear screams, no passers-by to notice something wrong. No one came for 4 days. The farm existed in a space outside the reach of community, of oversight, of help, and the killer knew this. He counted on it. He used the isolation as a tool, not just to commit the murders, but to remain afterward undisturbed for as long as he wished. For most people, the home is the fundamental unit of safety. It is the place where you are protected from the world, where the doors lock, where you sleep without fear. The Hinterkaifeck killer did not just violate a home. He violated the concept of home itself. He entered a place that should have been safe, destroyed everyone inside it, and then inhabited it as though it were his. He did not break the boundary between the outside world and the domestic interior. He erased it. And because the farm was demolished, because the physical structure no longer exists, the case has no anchor in the material world. There is no house to visit, no room to stand in, no tangible place where the mind can locate the horror and contain it. The farm is gone, the killer was never named, the case was never closed. All that remains is the story, and the quiet, irresolvable tension it leaves behind in every person who hears it. That tension has no answer, it was not designed to have one, and that is why, more than a century later, it has not faded. It cannot fade because it was never finished. If you've made it this far, I'm curious, which explanation stays with you longest? Was it Schlittenbauer, the neighbor with the key and the motive and the comments he could never quite explain? Was it Carl Gabriel, the dead husband whose body was never found? Was it someone from the community whose name appeared in the case file and then disappeared without resolution? Or was it someone who was never identified at all, a stranger who walked out of the forest, did what he came to do, and vanished back into it? Let me know in the comments, but for now, have a good rest.